In the quiet corners of her heart, where no one dared to look, she carried a pain too heavy to voice. Her tears fell in silence, her cries muffled by the weight of a world that never stopped to ask, "How are you?" This is the story of a mother whose love knew no bounds, but whose sorrow knew no end. Behind every gentle smile, there was a storm raging within her. She laughed for the world, but her eyes told a different story, one of sleepless nights and unspoken fears. Her days were a carefully constructed performance, a delicate dance of pretending everything was fine. She woke each morning with the weight of the world pressing on her chest, yet she rose, dressed, and faced the day with a quiet determination. Her children saw her as a pillar of strength, her husband as the glue that held their lives together. But no one saw the cracks forming beneath the surface. Her mornings began before the sun rose, in the stillness of a house still wrapped in sleep. She moved through the kitchen like a ghost, preparing breakfasts, packing lunches, and folding laundry with hands that trembled faintly. The silence was her only companion, a fragile piece before the chaos of the day unfolded. She cherished these moments, even as they reminded her of how alone she felt. The world outside demanded so much of her, endless tasks, unspoken expectations, and the constant need to be everything to everyone. And yet, she gave willingly, pouring herself into every role she played. Her children were her greatest joy, but also her deepest source of worry. She watched them grow with a mixture of pride and fear, knowing that each step they took toward independence was a step away from her. She wondered if they would ever understand the sacrifices she made, the pieces of herself she had surrendered to ensure their happiness. She kissed their scraped knees and soothed their nightmares, but who was there to soothe hers? Her husband, though well-meaning, was often absent, lost in his own world of work and responsibilities. Their conversations had become routine, surface-level exchanges that never touched the heart of what she was feeling. The days blurred together, a cycle of giving and giving until there was little left to give. She found herself staring at the mirror, searching for the woman she used to be. Where had she gone? The girl with dreams and laughter, the one who believed in endless possibilities. She was still there, buried beneath layers of exhaustion and duty, but it was becoming harder to find her. The weight of her unspoken pain grew heavier with each passing day, a silent burden she carried alone. There were moments when the mask slipped, when the facade of strength wavered. A forgotten birthday, a harsh word from a loved one, or the simple ache of an empty house could bring her to the edge. But she always pulled herself back, swallowing her tears and forcing a smile. She had learned to hide her pain so well that even she sometimes forgot it was there. But it lingered, a shadow in the corners of her heart, waiting for the moment when it could no longer be ignored. Her friends saw her as the one who had it all together, the perfect mother, the devoted wife, the reliable confidant. They came to her with their problems, seeking comfort and advice, never realizing that she was drowning in her own silent struggles. She listened, she counseled, she held their hands, but who was holding hers? The truth was, she didn't know how to ask for help. She had spent so long being the strong one that she didn't know how to be anything else. The nights were the hardest. When the house was finally quiet and the demands of the day were done, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her mind raced with thoughts she couldn't silence, worries about the future, regrets about the past, and the gnawing fear that she was failing in some way. She wondered if anyone would notice if she simply disappeared, if the world would keep turning without her. But then she would hear the soft breathing of her children in the next room, and the thought would vanish as quickly as it came. They needed her, and that was enough to keep her going. Yet, even as she pushed forward, the cracks continued to spread. Small things began to unravel: a missed appointment, a forgotten promise, a meal left uncooked. Each misstep felt like a failure, a sign that she was losing control. She tried to hold it together, to keep the pieces from falling apart, but the strain was becoming too much. The storm inside her was growing louder, threatening to break through the walls she had built. And then, one day, it happened. It was a moment so small, so insignificant, that no one else would have noticed. But for her, it was the final straw. She stood in the kitchen, staring at a broken plate on the floor, and something inside her snapped. The tears she had held back for so long came rushing forward, a flood of emotion she could no longer contain. She sank to the floor, her body shaking with sobs, as the weight of everything she had been carrying came crashing down. In that moment, she was no longer the strong one, the perfect one, the one who had it all together. She was simply a woman, broken and weary, who had given everything she had and had nothing left to give. The silence that had once been her refuge now felt suffocating, a reminder of how alone she truly was. But as she sat there, surrounded by the pieces of her shattered strength, she realized something she had long forgotten. She didn't have to do it all alone. The road ahead would not be easy. Healing would take time, and the scars of her pain would remain. But in that moment of vulnerability, she found a glimmer of hope. She was not invisible, not forgotten, not beyond saving. Her tears, once silent, had finally been heard. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was the first step toward finding her way back to herself. She gave everything, her time, her dreams, her very soul, for the ones she loved. But as the years passed, the cost of her sacrifices began to carve cracks in her spirit. The weight of her devotion, once a source of pride, now felt like an anchor dragging her deeper into an ocean of exhaustion. She had always believed that love was enough, that her unwavering commitment would shield her from the toll it took. Yet, as she stood in the quiet aftermath of her breaking point, she began to see the truth she had long avoided. Love, no matter how deep, could not fill the emptiness growing inside her. Her days were a mosaic of selflessness, each piece a fragment of her identity given away. She had once dreamed of a life filled with passion and purpose, but those dreams had faded into the background, replaced by the relentless demands of motherhood and marriage. She remembered the woman she used to be, the one who painted, who sang, who dreamed of traveling the world. That woman felt like a stranger now, a distant memory overshadowed by the reality of her present. Her hands, once skilled with a paintbrush, now only knew the texture of laundry and the grip of a vacuum. Her voice, once filled with song, now only spoke in hushed tones of comfort and reassurance. The sacrifices she made were not grand gestures but small, everyday acts of love that went unnoticed. She gave up her career to stay home with her children, trading boardroom meetings for playdates and deadlines for bedtime stories. She put her hobbies aside, her passions tucked away in a box labeled someday. She even surrendered her solitude, her moments of quiet stolen by the constant needs of those around her. Each sacrifice felt like a piece of her soul chipped away, leaving her hollow and yearning for something she couldn't name. Her husband, though loving, had grown accustomed to her endless giving. He saw her as the foundation of their family, the steady force that kept their lives running smoothly. But he didn't see the toll it took, the way her shoulders sagged under the weight of her responsibilities. He didn't notice the way her eyes dimmed when she spoke of her dreams, now buried beneath the weight of their shared life. He loved her, but his love was passive, a quiet appreciation that never quite reached the depths of her need. Her children, too, were oblivious to her struggles. To them, she was simply Mom, the one who kissed their bruises, packed their lunches, and cheered them on from the sidelines. They didn't see the exhaustion in her eyes, or the way her hands trembled when she thought no one was looking. They didn't know the nights she lay awake, worrying about their futures, or the days she pushed through her own pain to ensure they were happy. They loved her, but their love was innocent, unaware of the sacrifices that made their world possible. The cracks in her spirit grew wider with each passing day, her resilience wearing thin. She tried to hold on, to keep giving even when there was nothing left to give. But the emptiness inside her was becoming too vast to ignore. She found herself staring at old photographs, longing for the woman she used to be. She wondered if she would ever find her way back to herself, or if she was destined to disappear entirely, lost in the roles she had taken on. There were moments when she tried to reclaim pieces of herself, fleeting attempts to reconnect with the person she had once been. She signed up for a painting class, only to cancel when her son came down with a fever. She bought a plane ticket for a weekend getaway, only to return it when her daughter's school play conflicted with the dates. Each time, she told herself it was just a temporary setback, that she would try again later. But later never came, and the pieces of herself slipped further out of reach. The breaking point came on an ordinary day, in the midst of an ordinary task. She was folding laundry, her hands moving mechanically as her mind wandered. The monotony of the chore mirrored the monotony of her life, a never-ending cycle of giving and doing. As she folded her husband's shirt, she noticed a small tear in the fabric. It was a tiny imperfection, barely noticeable, but it triggered something deep within her. She stared at the tear, her vision blurring with tears of her own. In that moment, she saw herself in the shirt, worn, frayed, and on the verge of unraveling. The tears came without warning, a flood of emotion she could no longer contain. She sank to the floor, clutching the shirt to her chest as sobs racked her body. The weight of her sacrifices, the years of giving without receiving, came crashing down around her. She cried for the dreams she had abandoned, the pieces of herself she had lost, and the love she had poured into a world that never seemed to give back. She cried until there were no tears left, until she was empty and raw, sitting amidst the piles of laundry that symbolized her life. In the stillness that followed, she felt a strange sense of clarity. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to acknowledge the truth. She could not keep giving until there was nothing left. She had spent so long being everything to everyone that she had forgotten how to be anything for herself. The realization was both terrifying and liberating, a painful awakening to the reality of her own needs. She knew the road ahead would not be easy. Reclaiming herself would mean setting boundaries, saying no, and prioritizing her own well-being. It would mean confronting the guilt that came with putting herself first and facing the fear of disappointing those she loved. But as she sat there, surrounded by the remnants of her breaking point, she felt a glimmer of hope. She had spent so long carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders, but she didn't have to carry it alone. The first step toward healing was acknowledging her own worth, and in that moment, she finally did. In a house full of people, she felt utterly alone. Her struggles were invisible, her pain dismissed. No one noticed the way her hands trembled or the way her voice broke when she thought no one was listening. The walls of her home, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison, trapping her in a world where her needs were secondary, her voice unheard. She moved through the days like a ghost, present but unseen, her presence taken for granted by those who relied on her most. The loneliness was a quiet ache, a constant companion that no amount of busyness could drown out. Her husband, though physically present, was emotionally distant. Their conversations had become transactional, revolving around schedules, bills, and the children. The deep connection they once shared had faded, replaced by the mundane routines of daily life. She longed for the days when they would talk for hours, sharing dreams and fears, but those moments felt like a lifetime ago. Now, even when they sat together, she felt a chasm between them, a gap too wide to bridge. She tried to reach out, to express the heaviness in her heart, but her words seemed to fall on deaf ears. He would nod, offer a quick solution, and return to his own world, leaving her feeling more isolated than before. Her children, though loving, were too young to understand the depth of her struggles. To them, she was a constant, a source of comfort and stability. They came to her with their needs and desires, unaware of the toll it took on her. She cherished their love, but it was a one-sided exchange, her giving and their taking. She told herself it was natural, that this was the role of a mother, but the imbalance left her feeling hollow. She wondered if they would ever see her as more than just mom, if they would ever recognize the woman behind the role. Even her friends, the ones she had once confided in, seemed distant now. Their lives had moved forward, filled with careers, hobbies, and adventures, while hers had stagnated in the endless cycle of motherhood. They would ask how she was, but the question felt perfunctory, a polite gesture rather than a genuine inquiry. She would smile and say she was fine, hiding the truth behind a mask of normalcy. She didn't want to burden them with her pain, but the act of pretending only deepened her sense of isolation. The loneliness seeped into every corner of her life, coloring even the simplest moments. She would sit at the kitchen table, sipping tea and staring out the window, wondering if anyone would notice if she disappeared. The thought frightened her, but it also lingered, a quiet whisper in the back of her mind. She felt like a shadow, existing but not truly living, her presence unnoticed and her absence unremarkable. The weight of her invisibility pressed down on her, a constant reminder of how alone she truly was. There were moments when she tried to break free from the silence, to let someone see the pain she carried. She would drop subtle hints, hoping someone would notice and reach out. But her attempts were met with indifference or misunderstanding, leaving her feeling even more unseen. She began to wonder if she was the problem, if her pain was somehow unworthy of attention. The doubt gnawed at her, eroding her sense of self-worth until she felt like a stranger in her own life. The breaking point came on a day that started like any other. She woke early, as always, and began her morning routine. But as she moved through the motions, she felt a growing sense of despair. The loneliness, once a quiet ache, had become a deafening roar, drowning out everything else. She tried to push it aside, to focus on the tasks at hand, but the weight was too much to bear. As she stood at the sink, washing dishes, she felt the tears begin to fall. They came silently at first, then in great, heaving sobs that shook her entire body. She sank to the floor, her back against the cabinets, and let the tears flow. The loneliness she had carried for so long spilled out, a flood of emotion she could no longer contain. She cried for the connection she had lost, the understanding she craved, and the love she felt slipping through her fingers. She cried until there were no tears left, until she was empty and raw, sitting amidst the remnants of her breaking point. In the stillness that followed, she felt a strange sense of clarity. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to acknowledge the truth. She could not keep living this way. The loneliness was not something she could simply endure. It was a wound that needed to be healed. She knew it would not be easy, that it would require vulnerability and courage, but the alternative was unthinkable. She could not continue to exist in the shadows, unseen and unheard. She rose from the floor, her legs trembling but her resolve steady. She wiped her tears and took a deep breath, feeling a glimmer of hope for the first time in a long while. The road ahead would be difficult, but she was no longer willing to walk it alone. She would find her voice, her strength, and the connection she so desperately needed. And in doing so, she would reclaim the life she had lost, one step at a time. The breaking point had come and gone, leaving her raw and exposed, but also strangely liberated. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of her pain without trying to bury it or push it aside. The tears she had shed were not just an expression of sorrow, but also a release, a way of letting go of the burden she had carried for so long. As she sat in the quiet aftermath, she realized that the storm inside her had finally begun to subside, leaving behind a fragile sense of clarity. She knew that healing would not happen overnight. The cracks in her spirit ran deep, and the loneliness that had consumed her for so long would not simply vanish. But for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope, a quiet understanding that she didn't have to face her pain alone. The walls she had built around herself, though once necessary, were no longer serving her. It was time to let them down, to allow herself to be seen and heard, even if it meant risking vulnerability. Her first step was small but significant. She reached out to her husband, not with anger or blame, but with honesty. She told him about the loneliness she had felt, the weight of her sacrifices, and the fear that she was losing herself. To her surprise, he listened. He didn't offer solutions or dismiss her feelings. He simply held her hand and let her speak. In that moment, she felt a connection she hadn't felt in years, a reminder that they were still partners, even after everything they had been through. With her children, she began to set boundaries, not out of resentment, but out of love, for them and for herself. She explained that she needed time to recharge, to rediscover the parts of herself that had been lost. At first, they resisted, accustomed to her constant presence, but over time, they began to understand. She watched as they grew more independent, taking pride in their ability to do things for themselves. It was a bittersweet realization, but one that filled her with hope for the future. She also reconnected with her friends, reaching out to those she had drifted away from over the years. At first, it felt awkward, as though she were stepping back into a life that no longer fit. But as she shared her struggles and listened to theirs, she felt a sense of belonging she hadn't realized she was missing. They reminded her of the woman she used to be, the one who laughed freely, dreamed boldly, and lived with passion. Slowly but surely, she began to reclaim those parts of herself. The journey was not without its challenges. There were days when the weight of her pain felt unbearable, when the loneliness crept back in, threatening to pull her under. But she had learned to recognize those moments for what they were, temporary setbacks, not permanent failures. She allowed herself to feel the pain without letting it define her, knowing that healing was not a straight path, but a winding road with ups and downs. As the months passed, she began to notice small but meaningful changes. She rediscovered her love for painting, setting up a small studio in the corner of the house where she could lose herself in color and creativity. She started taking walks in the evenings, not as an escape, but as a way to reconnect with herself and the world around her. She even began to dream again, not just for her children, but for herself. Dreams of travel, of growth, of a life filled with purpose and joy. Her relationships began to shift as well. Her husband, inspired by her honesty, began to open up about his own struggles, creating a deeper sense of intimacy between them. Her children, though still young, started to see her as more than just mom. They saw her as a person, with her own needs and desires. And her friends became a source of strength and support, reminding her that she was not alone. The loneliness that had once defined her life began to fade, replaced by a sense of connection and belonging. She realized that she didn't have to be everything to everyone, that it was okay to prioritize her own well-being. In doing so, she became a better mother, a better wife, and a better friend, not because she was perfect, but because she was finally whole. The story of her pain did not end with a grand resolution or a sudden transformation. It ended with a quiet realization, an understanding that healing is not about erasing the past, but about embracing the present and moving forward with hope. She had carried her pain in silence for so long, but now she carried it with grace, knowing that it was a part of her story, but not the whole of it. As she stood at the threshold of this new chapter, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The road ahead was still uncertain, but she was no longer afraid to walk it. She had found her voice, her strength, and the courage to be seen. And in doing so, she had not only reclaimed her life, but also given herself the greatest gift of all, the gift of being truly, deeply loved, not just by others, but by herself. And so, her story closed not with an ending, but with a beginning, a promise of hope, healing, and the quiet beauty of a life lived authentically.